I got told once you shouldn't start one of these things with a disclaimer, but I do need to throw a big caveat out. If any of you are here because you think you're going to get parenting advice from either Tim or I, forget it. We do not have a clue what we're doing with our kids. But that is kind of why we're part of this DadMod community and why we're so stoked to be here at the inaugural DadMod event, because I think this is really important, this sort of community and the ability to have these conversations. What we do know a little bit about is this topic of resilience, and we want to spend just a bit of time tonight talking about, I guess, our journey and why we got interested in the subject and what we've learned along the way in cobbling together this book. Back in 2008, a much younger, fitter and sort of more bearded version of myself was a squadron commander of an SAS squadron group in a place called Uruzgan province in Afghanistan. And we had been in that country for about 7 odd years on and off since the September 11 attacks. And over that period, the evolution of the mission had changed. It had started out with us very much focused on reconnaissance, trying to work out who was who in the zoo and where were the good guys and bad guys. And by the way, if you can work that out in that country, you're doing a lot better than any of the Australian or American forces to date. But by 2008, we had a bit of a bead on where some of the combatants were, and our mission changed pretty markedly to a targeting role. We would try and get information about where the bad guys were and go out and remove them from the battlefield. Ideally, we would try and capture them, hand them over to the Afghan forces. Otherwise, there often ended up being a gunfight and they would get removed in other ways. And we'd been tracking this one individual for our entire rotation, and it was drawing to a close. We were just about out of that country, and one night, towards the very end of our rotation, we got a bead on this guy. Now, we used to have a saying in that targeting game that the bad guys had to get lucky every night and we only had to get lucky once. Well, this night we got lucky. We got a fix on this person, and it held into the hours of darkness, which was obviously our preferred time to go out and do our business. And so that met our threshold to launch. We decided, because we wanted to maintain the element of surprise, to launch by vehicles, not helicopters, and we drove out as quietly as we could. We inserted about 7 kilometres off the target and approached by foot for the last 7 kilometres. And we were guided onto our target by a Reaper drone, which was actually controlled from Las Vegas, which is a really weird sort of concept in sort of technology, but it was flying directly overhead, and it marked the target of interest with an infrared strobe and guided us on. It also told us, because it had cameras on that target, it also told us that there were sentries on the high walls around the target. And so we decided to try and make as stealthy approach as we could and blow into the compound with explosive charges. We snuck up, we got all of our call signs in position. There's this awful wait while you're right on the precipice and everyone jockeys into the last sort of positions. And as we got the final radio call signs that everyone was in location, I gave the initiation code word, ready, 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 stand by, go, go, go. And on that, 4 explosive charges blew holes in the mud brick walls of the koala, and we stormed into the compound. Almost immediately, we were met by gunfire from various positions throughout the compound, and we were able to fight our way through. It was pretty hard going. It was certainly a long night at the office, and by the time we'd finished that clearance, the sun was just starting to crest over this beautiful Afghan morning. We'd been lucky. We'd taken no casualties. The bad guys had taken a few, and we'd taken a few detainees, so it was still a pretty tense moment. But I must admit there was a pretty significant sigh of relief as we loaded our detainees and the rest of our force onto the cars that we called up to the compound location. I remember it was a beautiful, crisp Afghan morning. The weather hadn't started up, it was still nice and cool, and we were driving home to what we knew was going to be safety behind the razor wire of our forward operating base and our last mission of that rotation. And we'd got to within about 3 kilometres of that safety when all of a sudden the vehicle in front of me just disappeared in this massive cloud of thin brown smoke. Now, I don't know if it was a case of sort of art imitating life or the other way around, but I don't remember hearing the explosion. It was like one of those movies where all of a sudden the soundtrack just cuts out. You know, the chattering of the vehicle and the radios and the noise in the back of the cab, everything just dropped out, and it was replaced by this really sort of high-pitched tinnitus sort of monotone. I also don't remember getting out of my vehicle, but I must have, because the next thing I recall, I was at the rear of the car that had hit that IED. What greeted me there was a scene that can only be described as utter chaos. The vehicle had been folded back on itself and its contents were strewn around almost like the entrails of a wounded animal. I remember looking up at a tree just to my right and seeing a pair of underpants and a Snickers bar wedged in the tree. And clearly they'd been blown there by the blast. But I remember spending about 30 seconds just baffled as to what kind of weird Afghan tree flowers in undies and chocolate bars. And at the base of the tree was one of our guys who'd also been blown out of the vehicle, and he was fastidiously trying to fix this tiny little tear in his trousers, and he was seemingly oblivious to the fact that blood was gushing out of this massive cut on his neck onto his body armour at his front. Now, it was about this time that the soundtrack kicked in, and the first thing that I heard, and I can still hear, is a person screaming the word 10 over and over again at the top of their voice. And it was kind of like the Snickers bar in the tree. I couldn't place it. It made no sense until I realised that our medics had already got to his side and they were administering morphine. And they were asking him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, I remember a few pretty profound things from that time. The first was the fact that each of our individuals within that troop were reacting in a markedly different way to that same situation. The majority of them were pretty much doing what they'd been trained to do, and I'm pretty proud to say that even amongst that sort of chaos and that carnage, they were going about their business as they'd been trained to do. But there were a couple who seemed elated. They were having the best day of their life. They were on the top of their game, they were controlling their teams, they were pushing people out, and they were joking, they were laughing. They seemed to be really kind of enjoying this weird situation. And then there are a few, including the driver, who were just in pieces. Now, the driver, interestingly, was unscathed, completely unscathed from this blast, which was really peculiar. But he'd also just had a baby, or his wife had just had a baby back in Australia who he'd never met. And so on this 3 kilometres from home, from meeting his daughter, he'd just about blown himself up. So understandably, he was pretty shook up. But there were another couple of guys who were also pretty messed up from that incident. It was situations like that that really got us interested in this concept of resilience. We sort of thought that we were pretty tough. We were generally pretty physically fit. We'd done this selection course and this training that meant we were kind of mentally robust. But clearly, it had to be something more than that made this concept of resilience. And since then, we've seen a lot of people from our line of work who have fallen into pretty hard times, again, with very similar experiences to others. And so that set us on a bit of a journey to try and work out what are the constituent elements of resilience, and importantly, how can we improve it before we have this traumatic event that leaves us in bits. And so that has led to us developing this model called the Resilience Shield.
Have you got your undies out of the tree? G'day everyone, I'm Tim. Here's an exam question for you. I get to introduce this topic of stress, and no disrespect to the mothers who are absolutely amazing, but if I can direct my exam question to the blokes, how many of you have no children? How many of you have boys? How many of you have girls? How many of you have boys and girls? And everyone with girls, keep your hands up. There is nothing we can do for you here tonight. And I say that having 2 girls of my own. They are like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda and an outlaw motorcycle group put together. So let's talk a little bit about stress. And we often think about stress only in a negative sense. There were 2 academics, Yerkes and Dodson, that introduced a law about stress. It's called, not surprisingly, the Yerkes-Dodson law. And it recognises that to be optimised, to perform at our best, we must have some stressor in our life. We can be, excuse the word, under-aroused. The moment you wake up in the morning, you don't feel like you're going to pull your running shoes on and go and do anything spectacular, nor do you feel like you're cognitively ready to go and do anything that requires deep thought. The next little quadrant in their model is the zone of optimisation. And if you want to really geek out on this, some Stanford academics have done some work called the Stanford Walking Study that shows that physiological changes in your body create this optimum state of arousal, make you perform at your best. The third quadrant starts to fall away from that performance level, and it recognises that we can be overstressed, where we start to do things that are odd, that are peculiar. And the last quadrant, the worst performing band for in the Yerkes-Dodson law, is burnout, where we see chronic stress, anxiety and or depression, where we see chronic problems with physical health and or emotional health. Now, if I can give you one little example from our crisis management practice. Recently, we had a large industrials company that activated their incident management team. And the guy who led that team felt all of the physiological changes to realise that he's in this optimum band of stress. It was his time to shine. He had an incredible number of resources and he was navigating this large brand through a crisis that would either make them or break them, but he was at the dead centre of it. Now, as this crisis turned from days into weeks, he looked around his incident management team room and recognised that there are things that people are doing that are completely irrational. We've just agreed some priorities and the HR manager is going and doing something completely different. What he should have known if he understood this law was that they'd drifted over into the third band, where they had realised so much physical and cognitive overload that their decisions were being degraded. So it's a bit like Goldilocks, this thing called stress. Not too little, not too much, just the right amount. And if you think about your own lives where you've performed at your absolute best, I'll nearly guarantee you that there was some stressor in your life. It might have been a time imperative, it might have been something else that forced you to be at your absolute best. So view stress in a different light. View it as a necessity to be at our best. Let's turn our attention now to this topic of resilience, chronically overdefined. But in order to be resilient, we must face some form of adversity. And our model recognises the need for adversity to ensure that you can be resilient. Now, in the dictionary definitions, in the literature, there's a whole heap of muddling and confusing work about whether you are resilient before a stress event or you get resilience after the stress event. And it's a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. The one thing that isn't well defined, however, is how do we become more resilient? And this is where our model in the Resilient Shield recognised a need for a lattice work of things. In our model, there's an innate layer, what you all brought tonight. We all have some innate resilience built into us. The next layer is the mind layer, which is our outward view of life, being determined, showing a bit of grit, but also our ability to flush our mind of all the nonsense. The third layer is the body layer, sleep, diet and exercise. The fourth is our social layer, the need for a level of social support. And last and certainly not least is the professional layer. It will be really stressful if we suck at our job. So let's address each of those things in turn. But before we do, let's go on a little trip down a street called Chicken Street. And we're going to go back to where that Snickers bar was still in the tree, in a place called Afghanistan, in the capital, Kabul. And Chicken Street is a market street. Unusually, despite the name, you can't buy any meat on Chicken Street, but it is an absolute mercantile hurricane. Traders walking into the middle of the street to try and take your US greenbacks off you, selling you anything you can possibly dream of. But one of the ways to get away from that hurricane is to disappear into one of the many carpet shops. And as you walk into the carpet shop, as a SAS trained foreigner, your eyes quickly adjust to the gloom and you search for threats and an exit, neither of which are readily apparent. But the one thing you will realise is an old carpet salesman is in there, usually with a younger assistant, and generally they won't speak any English at all. They'll immediately offer you, in great Afghan hospitality, a cup of green tea. It's a loose leaf tea. And they'll pour it into your cup, you'll sip around the leaf, and the one thing you're guaranteed of is that you'll get about 3 tablespoons of sugar. Don't like sugar? Just don't stir your tea. The carpets in the carpet shop are stacked about 3 metres high, and there'll be hundreds, if not thousands of them. And you'll point to carpets, that carpet salesman and their young assistant will pull them down onto the ground, and you'll be captivated by the colours and the geometry on the top of the carpet. You'll want to stroke the top of the carpet. Imagine how incredible that thing is going to look on your lounge room floor. And oh, by the way, you'll pay about 10% of the price that you would pay in a place like Manhattan. Now, oddly, the carpet salesman keeps wanting to turn the carpet over, not showing you the geometry and the colours on the top of the carpet, but keeps referring to the weave on the bottom of the carpet. As they say, an Afghan carpet gets its strength from the underside, the strength of the weave, the knots per square inch. It's kind of like our lives. We look fantastic on the surface. Our Instagram pictures look absolutely amazing, but our resilience is really about the strength of the weave.
So let's have a look at these different layers that make up that interwoven weave. Can you have any other kind of weave that make up the weave that Tim just spoke about? The first one we want to talk about is the innate layer. Now, when we were doing our research, we recognised that there was going to be a genetic component to resilience. And we very much thought that this was the start point. We thought it was important because you wanted to acknowledge that as we sit here, each of us is going to have a different baseline level of resilience. There's a little bit of nature, there's a little bit of nurture, there's genetics, there's epigenetics, there's all sorts of things. There's whether your dad came and watched your cricket game when you were a kid and all these sorts of things that you've gone through. And we sort of thought that that was kind of important, but there wasn't much we can do about it. Now, we can't obviously turn back time and make sure that your dad went to your cricket game when you're under 13s, but there's a whole bunch of cognitive behavioural therapy type techniques that you can actually use to look back on your life journey to this point and reframe it. And certainly these are the basis of a lot of trauma-based psychological interventions, but even short of that, we've got a choice as to how we view our upbringing. We can either view ourselves as victims and, you know, all this stuff happened to me, or we can look at it through a slightly different lens and think that I'm here, standing here at this moment because of all of that, sometimes in spite of all of that. And we can look at these traumas and these turmoils that we've gone through and take a lot of pride in the fact that we're still standing at the end of them. A very interesting way of reflecting on that idea of your nurture. The other important thing, particularly as dads, when we look at this concept of nurture, is just how important it is that we give our kids a little bit of exposure to those stressors. As Tim said, the academics are still wrestling on this perfect definition of resilience, but the one thing they can agree on is that you need to have had some stress to develop resilience. The more we mollycoddle and sort of helicopter parent and wrap our kids in cotton wool, the less they have that chance to achieve those stresses, get through them, and come through and develop resilience on the other side. So this innate layer recognises that we're all different. It recognises that definite requirement for stress. And I think as parents, it shifts a bit in terms of how we look at the impacts of these mild, overcomable traumas for our children. So we've got to the innate layer. We reckon that's pretty fixed. Let's talk about some of the modifiable layers, starting with what our research says is the most important, the mind layer.
So everyone knows that in the SAS, the first thing you have to get through is the SAS selection course. It's a multi-week activity, and as you stand there on day one and you look down the lineup at 150 plus others, men and women, you realise that there are some absolutely incredible athletes there. People who are physically incredible specimens. But generally speaking, the fittest people are gone on day 3, maybe day 4. And that got us to thinking about the importance of this modifiable layer called the mind, and how it should have primacy in the shield as the number one layer. And the way that it interrelates with all other layers, recognising that no layer stands on its own, like the underside of that carpet. So why were all the fit people gone on day 3 or day 4? Because they didn't exhibit that courage, grit, determination. And if you wanted to do a little bit of your own analysis, there's some amazing work on growth mindset by Carol Dweck on our outward journey on how we view life. I'm going to come back to that in a little while. The second part of the mind part is the internal view. Who remembers the test pattern? Good old test pattern. What was the purpose of the test pattern? So at about 9 o'clock at night, on the 3 stations you could look at back in the 1980s, on came the test pattern. And nothing happened overnight. I don't know what happened at the TV station, but nothing happened on the television. Very rarely now can we set our mind into a test pattern. And I'd nearly guarantee, speaking of the 2 a.m. anxiety moment that Chris mentioned in his opening remarks, that it will be because your mind is absolutely just racing. So how can we just cleanse it? And the psychologists will now tell us that we can do that very effectively through this thing called mindfulness or meditation. My own experience with meditation came very late. I'm only a novice 12-month meditator, but I've realised incredible benefits. And for all of you who have read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, anyone not read that? Put it on the list. That is a must read. It'll take you about 1 hour to read. It's a tiny book. Frankl himself was a Holocaust survivor, spent time in a concentration camp. He's a psychotherapist, and he examined the way that people behaved when put into this incredibly stressful environment. And a phrase from the book goes something like this: between stimulus and response, there's a space. And our view is how we use that space, how we create that space, how we do something in that space is critically important in our lives as dad. And when your kids are teeing off, it's how you take a breath and use that space and how you frame your response to the kids that will create not just value in their life, but value in yours as well. And mindfulness or meditation enables you to create that little bit of space. Another tool in the toolkit is this thing called locus of control. Anyone heard of locus of control? So locus of control is a dynamic model. You can't either be at either end, you move along it. And there are 2 parts to locus of control: an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. An external locus of control, or a person who has external locus of control, believes it's everyone else's fault. I didn't get the job because my boss doesn't like me. It wasn't fair. They're generally overweight, unhealthy. They're, by percentages, the largest cigarette smokers. People with internal locus of control believe they can change the outcome of any particular event. They can certainly influence it if they can't change it. So what they do when they come through unhealthy stressors or something doesn't go their way is they reflect on the reason why. They debrief their life. They work out, what lessons can I take from this in order to improve myself? Now, the last little story I'm going to tell you is a bit of a combination of those 2 from my time in a little country about the size of Tasmania called Sierra Leone. Now, I won't go through the potted history of the 10 years of civil war in Sierra Leone, but suffice to say it was atrocious. Atrocities were committed by the anti-government element, the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF. They used child combatants extensively who were absolutely fearless, children as young as 6, that the Sierra Leone army were absolutely terrified of. And on this one day we were expanding, as the polite way of putting it, government of Sierra Leone controlled territory. And our advanced elements had just taken this village that we knew was being held by the RUF. And unfortunately, they'd got wind that we were coming and had left. And the young Sierra Leone Army commander called me on the radio and he said, I need you to come up and take a look at this. And I went up to Captain James Conte, who was the company commander. I said, what is it? He said, sir, the RUF have gone, but I need to show you something. And we walked through the middle of this tiny village. There was 1 brick building and the rest were bamboo ataps. He says, sir, the RUF have a slaughterhouse here. Now, I don't remember walking into that slaughterhouse, but I do remember a couple of things. One, in the middle of the slaughterhouse was a thing that looked like an altar. It was nearly like a mini chapel. That didn't quite register. And then I looked at the walls thinking, why in this beautiful white building is this off-white streaks on the wall? And I quickly realised that that's where they were delimbing people, terrifying. I've never really thought about that since, not in a negative way. I've always thought, how can I reflect on that moment and really appreciate how good we have it, standing here in Mosman Park, Perth, and how we can use those sorts of experiences that confront us as terrifying, as absolutely tragic, to improve the quality of our lives and our kids. Let's move on to the next layer.
So speaking of delimbing, the next layer is about your body. And it comes as no surprise that there is a massive physical component to resilience. I am not going to insult anyone's intelligence or waste any of your time talking about the fact that sleep, diet and exercise are super important. We've been conducting a bunch of research in conjunction with UWA. We've got over 2,000 responses to a pretty in-depth survey on this concept of resilience. The thing that moves the needle in your body layer is sleep. If you're not getting between 7 and 8 hours sleep a night, you're doing yourself a disservice, but you all knew that anyway. You all know that we should be eating a little better and that we should be exercising a little more. But what you might not know is that there are some other interesting aspects that kind of interlink some of these layers. And one I really want to touch on in the body layer is this concept of breathing. We should all breathe, which obviously stands to reason. But I think when we look at the relationship between the body and the mind, breathing serves as a really interesting bridge. If you aren't quite there yet to get into meditation, if you're not quite at the point where you can get into the lotus position at work and start zoning out, breathing is a fantastic gateway drug. It stimulates a lot of the same sort of things. And for our background, we got taught breathing at a very early age. We got taught a thing called combat breathing. It's actually just box breathing, but we call it combat breathing because it sounded a bit tougher. But it is about as close to magic as I think I've found. It's a way of using a physiological lever, something you can control, like your breath, to reach in and adjust something that you often feel you can't control, like your emotional state. When you are stacked on the outside of a compound wall in Afghanistan, you are listening to the sentries walking above you, you're waiting for the rest of your call sign to get into position, your body starts to enter an amygdala response. It is stressed and you go into that classic fight or flight response. You get this cocktail of hormones flowing down a thing called your HPA axis that does some things to your body. It starts shutting down what it considers non-essential parts of your body and primes you to either fight or flee. And what this means is it does funky things, like gives you tunnel vision, so you only see the centre of what you're looking at. Gives you auditory exclusion. It drops away your fine motor skills. Basically, it strips you of all that shit you really want when you're going to about to kick in the door of an Afghan compound. And so we needed techniques to try and overcome this natural reaction. And the one we got taught was this combat breathing. It's a simple box breathing procedure. In for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. It is dead simple. You can do it at any time. And what it does is it has this magical effect of impacting your heart rate and your heart rate variability. It slows it down. It gives you some more control over your emotional state, gives you back that field of vision, calms you down, and as Tim said, it inserts a bit of a space between stimulus and response. It gets your amygdala out of the driver's seat and puts your prefrontal cortex back into the driver's seat, which is where you want it to be. I don't tend to kick in too many doors these days, but my kids press exactly the same buttons that any sort of combat situation did in terms of my fight or flight response, and I can guarantee that that combat breathing cycle works exactly the same way to give you a space between stimulus and response. I wholeheartedly encourage you to try it chronically as a part of your daily routine, a couple of cycles of any form of deep breathing, and also acutely. If you can get into the habit of when you feel yourself getting aroused, getting anxious, getting angry, getting nervous, of cycling through a couple of routines of box breathing, it will have, like I said, pretty magical responses.
The next and my favourite layer, the social layer. Now, this is an odd question to ask at the start of the social layer, but how many smokers do we have here? Who would like to start smoking 15 cigarettes a day? Well, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's the US Surgeon General, has told us that loneliness has the physiological equivalence of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So if you're lonely, you may as well be down in your pack, which is pretty terrifying when you think about it, that a doctor, a well-respected US doctor, is saying that that epidemic, loneliness, is likely to have a physical effect like cigarette smoking. So let's not be lonely in the social layer. About 5 years ago, growing up playing contact sport, I decided I was going to go back and play AFL Masters football. And I went down to Wembley Footy Club, not too far from here, and being a competitive type and liking tackling people and certainly loving kicking a few goals, that's the reason why I went there. And at the end of my first year at the club, at the presentation night, they presented a 30-year award to a guy who'd been at the club for all of that time. And this guy was a cancer survivor, and I definitely knew that. But he stood up and he said in his opening words, "This football club saved my life." And I looked left to my mate Kieran, who was a Royal Navy engineer, to make a bit of a joke out of it. And Kieran sort of had tears in his eyes. And I looked right to my mate Mike, who's a physio, and he also was visibly emotional. And then, oddly, for me at the time, a series of gentlemen then stood up to receive awards, best and fairest, best on ground, best new talent, and nearly all of them had the same story. Mr. Divorcee, if it wasn't for you fuckers, I don't know where I'd be. The guy who'd fallen off a ladder and broken his hip and was out of work. The whole footy club had rallied around him, done anything and everything that he wanted done at home. And that got me to thinking, maybe it's not about the football. 4 years later, I've got it. I realised that there is nothing less relevant at that football club than the piece of pigskin. The whole reason why those people are there is for that social network. And the psychologist will now tell you that this is a critical part of our resilience. In fact, it diminishes our vulnerability, which is the flip side nearly to being more resilient, to being less vulnerable. And it's been a wonderful journey to be there and watch these muted cries from people who want help, and to watch a community of middle-aged men rally around them. And this is why groups like this are incredibly important, or your Mahjong club or your CrossFit club, or whatever it happens to be. Amazing in this social network. So how can we be more present? There's a wonderful book by a gentleman by the name of Adam Fraser called Third Space. Anyone read Third Space? So his model is very simple. The first space is where we are now. The second space is where you're going, and the third space is the space in the middle. And he posits that the use of this third space is how we set ourselves up for success. We call it a psychological transition period. It's what you do between the front door of your house and going to work. How constructively do you use that time? When you're walking to a meeting, how are you using that time? Are you thinking junk, or are you starting to focus in on your next environment? Gail Kelly, former CEO of Westpac, told us a story once on how she, having run a bank of 30,000 employees and all of the stress that went with that, used to come home and use the drive home as this psychological transition period to forget about that day. Why? Because more importantly than being the CEO of Westpac, she was a wife and a mother of three. And she'd arrive at her front door and physically shake off the day, and then go into that home full of energy and enthusiasm that she wanted to be absolutely infectious in her family. In the SAS, we had two really great courses that you can use in your own life that make you pay more attention, be more present. The first one is the tactical questioning course, where we were taught how to run field interrogations. And the basis of asking a good question is about ensuring that the person you're asking that question of can't answer yes or no. It must be an open question. And to ask an open question, you have to use one of the interrogatives. How, what, when, where, why. Use that, and no one can give you a yes-no answer. It works an absolute treat on your 15-year-old boy lying on the lounge. Rather than asking him, "Did you have a good day, son?" "Yeah." Ask him, "What did you do today, son?" And you'll tend to find the quality of your interaction is far better. In the same way, when you go and meet someone after this and you're having a beer, try that same little trick. Use the tactical questioning technique. The second course was the close personal protection course, a course that we teach our guys how to be bodyguards for VIPs. Now, unfortunately, being a bodyguard, you've got to be thinking before the shot's fired at the Prime Minister, not after the shot's fired. And the way that you do that is you have to read threat. And the way that you do that is you focus very acutely on body language. How are people looking and positioning their body that might signal an intent to do something, either positive or negative, so you're ahead of that problem. There's a wonderful book, and I hope people have read this, called Body Language by Alan and Barbara Peace. Put it on your recommended reading list, and when you're in your next social engagement, look at how your body language is compared to the person who you're interacting with. Make sure that you're showing positivity. The small things do matter, like eye contact with them, like being open in the position of your body. As soon as you close off, guarantee it, the quality of that interaction will fall away. Let's go to the last layer.
So the final layer that we've recognised through our research that contributes to our resilience is the professional layer. Now, clearly, most of us spend a whole bunch of time at our jobs. It would stand to reason that this is going to have an impact on our lives and our resilience. There's a couple of really interesting things that cascade out at the professional layer. First one is this whole concept of purpose. Now, everyone would probably understand we want to find a job with purpose. A lot of us, however, I think sort of translate that to mean that we should sort of sell up all our possessions and go to the North Shore of Bali and run a surf school employing kids from an orphanage using recycled plastic surfboards or whatever. That could be pretty cool, but for a lot of us, it's not going to be a reality. A lot of us are going to be in jobs, everyone in this town's in jobs where we're raping the planet, I guess, in one form or the other. A lot of us may not have that sort of ultimate bliss as our sort of main professional vocation. But that certainly doesn't mean we can't find purpose in our work. And I guess in many ways it's an idea of maybe if you can't find that job with purpose, find purpose in your job. And a lot of this links to this concept of trying to develop virtuosity, simply trying to be good at what you're doing. If you're stacking shelves at Woolworths, trying to be incrementally better every single time. It sounds like a pretty simple sort of concept, but it is very funny how contagious that concept of excellence, the pursuit of virtuosity, can be, how it can cascade throughout all aspects of your life if you make it a habit. The other really interesting thing about professional mastery and the professional layer is that you tend to get domain-specific resilience. We use the joke that we were not too bad under gunfire, not too bad in combat situations, but come tax time, our palms start sweating and we get the cold shakes. We had domain-specific resilience in that martial context, but not so much in the accounting context, and probably accounts for our pending insolvency with our business. That's a separate issue, but we might hit anyone up if you've got some creative accountants in the audience, we could use it. But the interesting thing with that domain-specific resilience is that there has been research that say that this can then spread to other aspects. And so the concept of grit, which has been popularised by a lady called Angela Duckworth, who's done a lot of writing and podcasting on this, has identified that sort of grit that can help the accountant get through tax time or the soldier through the combat can also then spread across into other aspects of their life. So that the more you can develop that professional virtuosity, the more you can develop that mastery in one specific domain, the better off you can be in a whole range of, or a whole raft of aspects of your life. The final interesting thing about the professional layer is something of a cautionary tale. A lot of us, and I think particularly people in high-performing roles, and I think probably particularly guys, tend to blend our role and our identity. We tend to come very intertwined between what we do, what it says on our business card, and who we think we are. This is a very dangerous thing to do. If we are all in on our professional layer, if that's all we are, if that's all that we see of ourselves, then we run the real risk that if that gets taken away from us, particularly if it's unexpectedly, but even at the end of the day once we retire, then we can end up falling in a hole. And I think most of us might have seen people maybe from the previous generation, who have been masters of all they surveyed, right up until the point they got that gold watch, and then they became pretty rudderless at the end. They didn't have that social layer that Tim spoke about. They hadn't looked at their mind layer. They hadn't looked after their body layer, and there wasn't much left once the job was gone. So recognise the importance of the professional layer, but also recognise its limitations. If that is the only thing that's propping up your resilient shield, you have got some pretty big chinks in your metaphoric armour. Now, we've obviously thrown a whole bunch of stuff at you. We are obviously very busy. There are a real sort of tendency to find this is a pretty helpless situation, that we're supposed to get more sleep and shit, I'm supposed to eat better and put down that beer and go to that North Shore of Bali to get the job there and hang out with my mates and spend some time with them. It can be overwhelming. But the last little message we want to leave you with is this. For modern Western Special Operations Unit, Ground Zero is a place called Hereford in a little country town on the Welsh border in the United Kingdom. This is the home of the 22 SAS Regiment, the British Special Air Service, which is really the foundation of all modern special operations. Now, it's a pretty unimpressive barracks. When you walk in, you could be forgiven for being underwhelmed by what you see, some pretty squat, old, bleak buildings. But right at the centre of that barracks is a piece of sacred ground. There's a black, imposing clock tower that holds the names of every single member of the unit who's been fallen either in training or in combat. And in fact, the practice of inscribing the names of the fallen on that tower has given rise to a saying, beating the clock. If you've served in that unit and managed not to end up with your name inscribed on that, then you are considered to have beaten the clock. But there's another thing inscribed on that clock tower, and it's an excerpt from a poem by a guy called James Elroy Flecker. And the poem reads, "We are the pilgrim's master, we shall go always a little further." And those three words are what I'd like to leave you with. This isn't about revolutionary change. The fact that you're here means you care about your families, means you care about yourself. All we're recommending is just go that little further. Those little incremental changes in the directions towards building your stronger resilience are what's going to make the difference in the long run. Listen, we've gobbed off far too long. More than happy now to answer any questions you've got. Otherwise, we can hit the fire pits and talk more casually. Does anyone have any questions while we're still here?
That was fantastic.
I'm going to sing.
I told you we weren't going to give parenting advice. It is interesting though. I reckon that locus of control thing that Tim spoke about before is something my little N=2 experiment with my kids. That's the big thing. Everything is someone else's fault with them, and what we're really trying to do is instill that. You know, you've got to own it a bit. But yeah, I've got no answers for the kid question.
I love. It's another great night.
Hello?
Combat breathing. Is it through your nose or through your mouth?
They reckon in through your nose, out through your mouth.
Yeah.
Is what we got taught. But yeah.
So the question was on combat breathing. It's actually more about the deliberate practice of breathing than just, and we're breathing every day, it's kind of important, but the deliberate practice is what's super critical about combat breathing. There is a little covert method called the breath reset, which is 6 deep breaths in through the nose, out through the nose, in through the nose, out through the nose, times 6, and has a similar physiological effect. For anyone that has ever experienced an elevated heart rate, give it a go. It's incredibly effective for your next public speaking event in front of 50 DadMod people. Any others?
Grab a beer and we'll gather around the fire pit.
Thanks.
That was fantastic. Well done.